Good afternoon. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Eric Dietz. Dr. Dietz is the director of the Homeland Security Institute and professor in Computer and Information Technology Department. He has formerly served as founding executive director for the Indiana Department of Homeland Security. While there, Eric reorganized Indiana's public safety planning and response, led development of comprehensive plans, training, and exercises needed to optimize Indiana's emergency response, and led the state's response to 7 presidential major disasters and emergency declarations. Dr. Dietz retired from the U.S. Army in 2004, retiring as lieutenant colonel. While serving, he led Army research and acquisition programs, including chemical weapons detectors, command and control software, and Army power systems. Today, he will present the talk titled, "Where Does Sacrificing Liberty for Security Exceed Our Limits?" Please silence your electronic devices, but don't put them away. We'd like to see you tweeting with the hashtag Dawn or Doom. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Dietz.
Thanks. Kind of another first for me today. I've never had anybody actually draw my lecture as it's going on, so I'm looking forward to seeing how that turned out. Last semester, I had a student who brought a service dog in, and of course, the dog was in the classroom. My wife said, "Oh, well, what's the dog do?" And I said, "Well, the dog, it just goes to sleep like everybody else during the lecture." So, and it was pretty clear when the dog had reached his limit, because the dog would start snoring, So it was always good. So let's hope there's not too much of that today. I'm going to talk about partly the liberty-power tension, how our government works or doesn't work sometimes, but also how we, from a security point of view, try to look at measures and measurement process from that. We all kind of know the quote that has been attributed to Benjamin Franklin that says that those who sacrifice liberty and for terms of for security really deserve neither. And so really what I'm going to talk about is a little bit about that founding and how we might think about, with current research, how we might measure Homeland Security. Of course, I worked for Mitch Daniels when I was down at the state, so one thing Mitch was, President Daniels was really good for is making sure all of us had clear metrics, and that's really driven my research and some of the things I'm going to talk about today. So the purpose here is, I'm going to talk about liberty-power tension. I'm also going to talk about 4 different research projects that some of my students and I have worked on. Some of them are in the room. Adam Kirby has certainly worked on some of this, and some of the other students, they think they're going to get more extra credit by showing up here instead of the other sessions. So we'll see if that works out for them. Last, I really hope that there's some dialogue and some time that we leave at the end so you guys, can ask any questions or have a little better understanding of the research. First is Homeland Security. Really, if you think back from our founding documents, Homeland Security is not a new concept at all. Really, the foundation of the country as the frontier, the War of Independence, security was fundamental with everything that went into those founding documents and the nationhood here. So the Homeland Security isn't new. Perhaps really after 9/11, we've just given it a new name. In the classes I teach, as my students have, can attest, so we start out talking about this kind of liberty-power tension and kind of where that originates from. But really it originates from our founding documents. The Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights all act as those foundational documents that put tension in our government. It's not just tension in the political process as we listen to Donald Trump talk as he competes to be the next president and the rest of the field trying to make sure they get some attention, but that tension is true in Congress, it's true in the White House, it's between branches of government, and I would say it's, from at least my studies and our work, that tension's not necessarily a bad thing. We should reach some consensus before we go about trying to take on and make changes to our government. So the thinking in U.S. independence of this liberty-power tension was really central to, men and women. All individuals are created equal. Men are born in a state of freedom or liberty. But that's in contrast and conflict back to that tension with government. Government power is why we have independence or why we wanted independence. That tension between individual liberty and government power are constantly at odds. Really, I would say that's where we need to be as good as citizens, making sure we maintain the right level of tension. If we don't like naked millimeter radar scans of our body at the airport, we need to tell our elected officials and tell them that TSA is going too far with that. If we think that's fine, then tell your elected officials, or even by our absence of thought and talk, that it's just perfectly okay. But ultimately, government power or any power. It can be a threat to individual liberty, and the government power is certainly prominent there. Legitimate government needs to maintain that tension again, and basically we need to think about that. Where are we going to sacrifice liberty for safety? So the founding principles talk about natural law, human virtue, the goodness of man, goodness of people. It also talks significantly about separate branches of government. We've all had that in all of our civics and governments classes that we've had many times up to now, but that tension in government is actually can be somewhat good. We ought to reach consensus. We shouldn't do things in an arbitrary or trivial way, and we should have clear metrics and measures before we move forward, and that's where I'm driving this today. Traditionally, our Constitution and our founding documents called for a small military. We don't have a small military now. Well, we should be thinking about, what happens if we have too large a military? What size military is about right? How the Bill of Rights affects us today? How absolute are they? That should be part of our thinking. And that's constant tension. We have different political parties, different abstract views thinking about how those Bill of Rights ideas affect us today, and it's constantly being challenged in the courts. It's probably a good thing that we go back and reflect on why those were there, why fundamentally they were there, and why we continue to learn about those. And there needs to be limits on federal power. Also, the federal power also granted certain rights to states. That's another piece of this tension. We have tension throughout the federal government, throughout the levels of government. I would say from my time at the state, we have a lot of tension in local and state government as well. All those are positive things, or can be turned into positive things, but we need to be careful and make sure that we don't become overwhelmed with that tension or that conflict. And last, a well-educated citizenry who's responsible for maintaining that tension is vital. So a couple examples of how that tension has been damaged in the past is the Alien and Sedition Acts. Basically, John Adams, John Adams signed this bill, and he was very upset with people that were writing damaging, slanderous, mean things to him. It's hard to believe in the current political season that somebody would actually get a law passed that says you can't say bad things about the party in power. But that existed for a while. It existed, but it was allowed to expire under President Jefferson. That was part of that tension. We got to think about what was going on in 1798. We still were frontier. We still had a fragile government. We had a lot of financial problems, and the continuity of the federal government was not a settled situation. So we need to be thinking about how some of these things seem like good ideas at the time, but they may not turn out that way. 1940, again, we start thinking about this. World War II is the onset. The Smith Act made it illegal for people to talk about forcibly overthrowing the government. Start thinking about our Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights certainly says we have a right to free speech, we have a right to have this discussion, and we should have a right to be able to talk about where government isn't performing where we think it is. Of course, the Smith Act said that was now illegal. Perhaps in the worldview at the time, that probably made good sense, but a few court rulings that greatly limited the Smith Act basically brought that back into tension. So we see time after time this kind of back and forth tension. We see needs for security that aren't met. We demand something to be done. After the security need is in our past and we get a chance to reflect on it, things kind of right back, and the citizenry stands up and says it's time to put things back into neutral, at least back into balance. This happened as well after 2001 and through today with the Patriot Act. We've had several reauthorizations of the Patriot Act. Basically, that was tools that allowed our government to look at us from an IT perspective in many ways, many spectrums. And we've had many challenges, many reauthorizations of that act in pieces and parts, and that continues to be part of the tension. We can't imagine some of the actions that were originally taken after 2001, after 9/11, that we would tolerate today, but again, these things bring themselves back into control, and they should over time. So as we talk about those kinds of background things, how do we maintain that liberty-power tension? That really gets to where some of my research is, which is how do we measure these security-related events? If you imagine back to the TSA folks at the airport, how do we measure what they do? Is there any measure what they do? I mean, we go to different airports around the country. We see vastly different standards, vastly different, slight methodology to how they do things. And it almost seems obvious that there's no real federal oversight in that. My research is how do we build measurement techniques for that, so then we can take these security systems and bring them into what we, and from my background, would look like as engineering controls. If we can measure it, now we can perturb the system, we can change the system, hopefully improve the system, and be able to measure it later and see if it actually has gotten better. So that has really driven the research that, frankly, I needed when I was working at the state. We had a Homeland Security system that didn't exist before. We had branches of state government that didn't like each other or even talk to one another. And under Governor Daniels at the time, they were unified. Now, I was picked after they already had the bill passed that said it was all going to unify. So, it's one of those things that you hope you don't go into a reorganization not having any say as to how it's done. Fortunately, that was part of the fun of the process there. My employees got to know me the first time when I called them all in the auditorium, introduced myself, gave them the lecture or the presentation that said, here's how we've been told to reorganize, and here's the new supervisors. Don't leave till you know who you work for today, and business as usual, we'll be back to work Monday. So we need to be thinking about these measurement processes, how they drive us, how they drive our decision making, and ultimately how we improve security because of that. I've got 4 examples of programs that I've worked here with students and other staff and faculty at Purdue that I'm going to talk a little bit more about. One is social monitoring, or social media monitoring that we did for the 2012 Super Bowl, and really how we develop methods to mine those data systems that are out there that we've willingly put our information out with full public discovery. The second is a disaster response project that we did for the city of Chicago, actually looking at how to evacuate Chicago after hopefully the unlikely event that a 10-kiloton nuke goes off in downtown Chicago. There might be some days that we might think that looks like a good economic development project or a good urban renewal, but we probably don't want that kind of thing. The third is how we measure sporting events or event security of these large events. We can imagine a number of large events across Indiana, across the country that we have. From every weekend we have sporting events on campus and around our country. How do we develop measures to improve those kinds of events? And finally, I'll talk about active shooters, and I know that's kind of a near topic to us. A couple years ago, we had that kind of event here on campus. We'll talk about measures and actions that we've looked at to try to figure out how do we mitigate the active shooter process or events and improve our safety because of that. So the social media for the Super Bowl, basically what we did is we used a couple of tools, Radian6 and Visible Technologies. These were commercial software tools that were developed for the marketing industry. So basically, companies would have been using these tools to determine the effectiveness of their advertising and how much has the public really understood the advertising of companies like Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Dell Computers, and so on. So they would typically use these tools, and there's some sentiment analysis, and there's also some peak analysis that we did. So we essentially took those tools, and a couple of my students here, actually worked on this project. This really intended to be a demonstration project. We were going to do a couple of reports for the state, show them that this is something that we could do. Much to our students' alarm, we volunteered to basically do a daily report. After the state saw the first report, they said, gee, this is great. Can you do this every day and feed the intel process of the state? And of course we said yes, and then they worked every night from 9 to midnight, basically writing a report, and then the faculty working on it, worked from 1 to 2 to basically make sure the report was right and got back to the state. Essentially, we got several peaks. The blue peaks would be total information, total number of tweets, texts, what have you, and then there was red, which was negative sentiment, and the blue, or this darker, which was positive sentiment. What we were actually able to do is we were able to mine these peaks, some of which had thousands of tweets and texts and posts. I think that tallest one was, when Madonna was announced as the halftime act, that we would mine those for problems that happened or were going on at the event. So the human trafficking, the pickpocketing, and other public safety issues were there. So we were actually able to use this to find public safety problems, evidence of perception of the event. If you guys can remember from the 2012 Super Bowl, it was as much as we worried about a cold weather Super Bowl, it wasn't cold that year. It was actually pretty warm. As a result, the Super Bowl village that was intended to grow over time from a small footprint to a larger footprint was overrun. It was overrun, and much faster than the public safety were able to keep up with it. Well, it was very clear that we could look at the crowd and see it was overrun, but we were also finding it in social media and text, tweets, posts, that people were saying how crowded it was, how the displeasure. But we were also able to identify those safety problems, the human trafficking areas that maybe law enforcement hadn't found yet. We're able to find some of the pickpocket areas and also able to even find some security areas where some of the excavation hadn't been filled in afterwards, or there were people just simply twisting their ankles. So there were a number of public safety things that we were able to mine this to basically do a better job with public safety. If you think about that, I mean, we can sit back as government and wait for the public to tell us or wait for that outcry to happen, or we could use these tools, commercial tools, maybe some that need to be yet to be developed, to start thinking about how can government get more responsive to the individual needs. This is an example of an intelligence gathering or sort of a information gathering kind of process to try to make sure that the public is protected and safe. Second example is this Chicago Regional Hub Reception Center. Might be a little bit easier to kind of think of this as the Superdome for Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. We hope, though, since we helped write the plan, or we wrote the plan and did so with a number of partners, that this happens and runs a whole lot better. The idea here is, if there is an evacuation of a major city after disaster, and this was frankly done for the city of Chicago and for the Indiana, Wisconsin, and Illinois counties that surround the Chicago area, how do we manage that kind of large event? How do we manage it in terms of the resources that are needed, and also look at the resources that might be required to safely handle the wash of people that would come out? The people that we were particularly worried about were those that were called those that rely on public transportation, those that basically need government assistance. Most people with cars, are, if a 10-kiloton nuke goes off in your backyard, are not going to need a lot of other additional notice. They're going to get out of town. This is for those people who are going to rely on public transportation but need to get out. So the reception center had a number of steps in it. Included the planning, it included operational templates, and there were hundreds of people that were needed to run this reception center. That was the piece that we didn't see with New Orleans and the Superdome, which was the people and the resources to actually run that effectively. We actually, as a class project, in one of my classes, we actually took on the modeling of this overall center, and actually it became one of, in fact, it became Adam Kirby's master's thesis. That project summary basically is here. As a class, we built basically a flow diagram of all the steps that the reception center needed to take on. We looked at it in terms of how do we optimize the staff and the resources that would be needed in there, and we built a model. The model is basically an AnyLogic model, which is an object-oriented modeling tool, and we built a flow diagram of how people were going to move through an ideal reception center. Now, the ideal center didn't exist because that's going to be fairgrounds, coliseums, gymnasiums, other kinds of facilities. One of them that we tested was actually Valparaiso University. And so essentially these centers would have places like reception. Think of that as like the front desk at a hotel. Then we had other pieces of this like providing food and medical care. Now, we didn't really want to provide medical care in these centers, but we did need to provide basic care. If somebody had to leave their home abruptly and had medications, they might need to see a physician to actually get a script rewritten. They might have minor first aid things because of what has gone on. The medical wasn't intended to be in any way replace the emergency room or the hospital network. Also had food, water, showers, all those kinds of things that you would expect, and ultimately family reunification. There's one piece to this, that line right down the middle, this part is all about people. This part up above was all about pets. That comes about because of Hurricane Katrina specifically in the Pets Act. When I was a state director, we had probably about 2 pages of federal statute that told us how we deal with people. And the Pets Act saw it fit to make sure we had about 1,000 pages of statute to make sure that we treated pets properly and ethically. So, you start thinking about this. There's lots of guidance out there, and so some of it, our government works well. Some of it, a lot of the state Homeland Security and emergency management directors were really puzzled and bewildered how much guidance we got for pets, and maybe it says a little bit about what we think of our animals and not so much about each other. Essentially what we did is we modeled a series of combined results with total operating time, which this center was supposed to operate for about less than 7 days, We wanted people to rotate through or try to get out of the center and into more permanent shelter in about 12 hours or less. And we essentially ran this through with a staffing model inside the AnyLogic. So we had subject matter experts that built our plans and said we needed about 350 people for each one of these centers to process 20,000 people in 7 days. What the modeling allowed us to do and the data collection that went into each one of these boxes here allowed us to go back in, allowed my students to go back in. Again, that's one secret on campus. The faculty do hardly any work. The students do all the work, right? So the students were able to show and prove that we could run this center on perhaps around 250 staff people and how we might better authorize and allocate the staff accordingly. Again, not because subject matter experts think so, because the science of what all the pieces that need to go into these boxes and the modeling tells us is absolutely needed. So essentially what we're able to do is save hundreds of thousands of dollars per operating day. We're able to save hundreds of positions, because if you think 5 of these centers were planned to be operating around the Chicago area if there really was an evacuation needed, 325 people, maybe to 250 people for 3 shifts, 4 shifts for a week. It's a lot of positions to save, especially when we don't know where those volunteers are going to come run that center are coming from. And everyone that comes in needs a place to stay. They need food, support, logistics. They need training to get going. So any small savings in the overall staff really magnifies in the overall savings for the entire project. So this is a good example of how we can kind of use some of these, again, commercial tools, application, and do applied research to find ways to save in Homeland Security, and basically, again, to treat an emergency response problem like an engineering problem. That way we can change it, optimize it, we can change the steps, we can remove steps, we can see what kind of savings we'll get from that, and really try to make sure government is more responsive to public needs. Number 3 is event security, measuring event security. It's the same kind of problem. We've all stood in those long lines at one of these special events. We've paid our maybe hundreds of dollars for a ticket to get in, and you get to the front gate and you think you're almost there, ready to hand them your ticket, and you go, oh my gosh, look at the line, how long will I be here? So we've developed this as a matter of building a summer course. It started out a summer course that we actually did at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. There we are 1 year standing on top of the pagoda. We essentially went down, and at the Speedway we developed a process to measure security and to start to model and manage the throughput of security. So when you think about the problems that we have, do we have enough security? Right now at a major event, security is basically a very short conversation between an event manager and a security management firm. The event manager says, I only have this amount of money, and the security management firm moans about it a little bit and says, okay, we'll figure out how to do it for that. Then you basically get a line that builds up, or you get security lapses or weaknesses that emerge in the system. What we're trying to do here is measure the security so we can actually go to a different paradigm. How do we build performance-based contracts for security management? So that way, the security management firm, they get paid and rewarded if they do a good job, and they get penalized if they do a crappy job and basically annoy the customers, annoy those people that have paid hundreds of dollars for that ticket at the event. We've taken the same process. We did it last summer with the Indianapolis Pacers with a number of events that happen at Bankers Life Fieldhouse. Last fall, we did it at a rugby match with a partner university, Coventry University in the United Kingdom. We plan to go back there again and actually continue this process. Essentially, we can name any number of these large events. In the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, it's perhaps hundreds of thousands of people. Pacers, a couple, 20,000. Amazingly enough, what was this, Adam? 25,000 that fit in the arena to watch a rugby match. I will never again say baseball is boring, too, after sitting through a day of watching rugby. And finally, the bottom is Purdue football. We actually, as another class project, we actually applied the same process to Purdue football and actually allowed some of the insights that we had with each of these have permeated into the security process. In fact, for the 500, the several years that we did run that class at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, the students that wanted to were all hired back to not just to work the subsequent events with security, but to manage the security firm and the teams that were there afterwards. So let's give you an idea of kind of how we manage this process. Again, we looked at this to look at the number of bag checkers, look at the bag check time. So every time you go into those events, you open your bags up, somebody's got to look in there. What are they looking for? It's a good question, right? What are they doing? Sometimes they open the bag just to be nosy and see what's in there. Last time I went to the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, I handed them my heavy backpack, which was probably about 30 pounds with cameras and had a cooler and all kinds of other electronic gizmos in there. They didn't even open a zipper. They just pushed it back to me and said, "You're good to go." So this was right after the Boston Marathon activity. So that really should allow us to kind of think back and say, we really do need some standards put on these events, and we do need to make sure that we don't just feel safe, but we are safe with a measure and a metric. So to do this, we looked at the time to do bag checks, the number of cooler checks if you're at an event like the Indianapolis Motor Speedway that allows those, number of ticket checkers, the people who actually monitor and make sure your ticket is right, and the number of lines. Ultimately, what we want is not to see all those faces lined up in the lines, which this is all part of the simulation, again, done in AnyLogic, that we're able to do. We looked at each of these steps. How long does it take to do an adequate bag check? How long does it take to do an adequate cooler check? What measures go into that? We developed a quantitative measurement process that multiple students could stand at the gates, stand behind the gates out of the way, and be able to measure with numbers how is security being delivered. And we're able to basically manage and measure that to see throughput and effectiveness are different numbers. We can open the gate and let everybody walk in. That was the very first year we went to one of these events. We had our tickets. We went in just to kind of look at feasibility. And the line, as soon as the line got long, the folks running the gate said, "Everybody hold your ticket up and walk on through." So again, not much security at that time either. We need to be thinking about how we build this and how we build those measures in. The standards for the event are needed, and there really needs to be a more quantitative, absolute process to say, is security being delivered or not? And if it's not, we should go back and ask government and these event management firms, why aren't they delivering that security? That's what we ultimately need. Again, treat it like an engineering system. Also, we looked at customer service. That was one of the things that we quantified some measurements with, and we did that by using standards that, among other places, were used by the Disney Corporation. Disney has a number of things that they look for to make sure security and management of security are handled in a way that the public accepts. So if you think about the effectiveness of security, the time to deliver, basically the public reaction to the security process, we now have a way to basically, with our measurement, we've got a control knob. We can jack security up till we get people mad, and we can actually measure it at the back end. We can actually turn it back down. So we can take this liberty, power, tension idea and apply it right back and make sure that we apply as much security as our patrons at these events will tolerate. Not much more, but enough that we can actually be a little bit better assured that we're getting good delivery of services if we want to try to have these events as safe, wholesome events. We can also change that dialogue between the event management and the security management. Right now, the security management, for the most part, has to say, I'll take the job or I won't for that number. And so what we're able to do is we're able to go back and say, here's a more of an engineering approach to figure out how many security people are needed, how many individuals are needed to run security at that event, and at that level of staffing, how long is the average wait time expected to be, what are the shortcomings of the wait time, and then how can we better manage the overall process. Finally, the active shooter, and this is one that we've seen probably far too often here, or much. If we see it once, it's one too many times. But let's start with the active shooter definition, which is basically an individual engaged in killing. They have a plan. An active shooter, the typical active shooters, the ones that have occurred over the last several decades, the FBI has recently done a couple of surveys and reports. They talk about active shooters having a plan. They continue on their plan until they're stopped by some sort of barrier. Barrier tends to be a law enforcement officer, or they complete their plan. And basically, the law enforcement officer, it comes to a catastrophic outcome. Somebody's shot, or the police challenge the shooter, and the shooter shoots themselves. In most cases, the shooters are firearms, but there's no quantification. These active shooter events, they can be serious. We saw the Nebraska event where the individual was actually used a knife instead of a firearm and was on multiple people and would have gone and probably harmed other people with just the knife. The question ultimately is, how do we mitigate that? What's the best way to do that? And again, back to my typical faculty process, I had students in a class and assigned Adam and a couple other good students I had a problem of figure out how we mitigate an active shooter event. And that's what we're going to talk about with this piece here. So what they did is they went about looking at the active shooter event and looked at what is the mission. They did research and said, what are the last few dozen active shooter events? How do they behave? And we found some similar patterns. An active shooter shoots an individual about once every 20 seconds. An active shooter continues unabated, with remarkably little movement as well. As a military retiree, a military veteran, I was surprised that was a little bit slower than I would have thought, a little bit less mobile than I would have thought. Not assaulting through the objective we would expect in the military. But the active shooter, basically, we were able to build a model, the students were able to build a model that randomly attributed behaviors from different active shooters that historically had happened and looked at different response mechanisms that we might have. And we looked at several things. We looked at response time of police. That's ultimately what our hope is and our expectation is the police response time is going to come and stop this event before it happens. Keep in mind, about once every 20 seconds, an active shooter is discharging a firearm into a victim. It takes, on average, police response time in the U.S. is about 10 minutes. So if you do the math, that's quite a few casualties. Second is we looked at armed security. What does armed security buy? And how do they enhance the situation? We also looked at concealed carry, and basically the concealed carry that's permitted in almost all of our states now. And then finally, especially after the January event here at Purdue, we looked at just locked doors. And we looked at how each one of those contribute overall to the security situation. So we came up with a model using a similar kind of flow diagram process to what I showed you before. The model basically has a run button, has one place that we can actually add time that says what's the police response time or travel time to the location. Next is what's the concealed carry probability? Is it a small percentage? Is it zero? Or does everybody have a concealed carry? And finally, is the security guard present? So we can actually go in, and in the modeling environment, we don't need to wait for a disaster to happen. We can actually simulate the disaster, and we can do it hundreds of times. So we can take this averaging process of hundreds of trials, hundreds of attempts to try to find the right and refine the right policies to see what works. And we can actually come up with answers that says, if an active shooter event happens, how do we manage this kind of thing? So this is the startup screen. Basically, the model running is going to have several pieces, and I'll show you the model here in a minute. It basically have a score card here. It'll basically have dots of different color codes. It'll show you the employee status, a healthy employee, a wounded employee, the shooter, the security guard if present, and the police officer when they arrive. We basically developed this using a gun-free zone kind of office space, similar to the Chattanooga recruiting station. And one thing that InLogic is very good for is it allows you to basically, in one environment, you can do system dynamics modeling, discrete event modeling, or agent-based modeling. And this is an example of a couple of those. We've got the agents that are within the office. They each have different attributes. We have the police station, or basically the response time for the law enforcement officer that gets to this facility. So the model completed afterwards will basically show a status of wounded and healthy employees. And it'll show, again, the results. Number of people that would have been shot, engagement of the shooter, and the time for the engagement of the shooter. So here's an example of that model running. No security guard present. 0% employees with concealed carry, and we basically, do that randomized process of kind of the shooter attributes. We see the longer the police response time, the more casualties we have. That should be obvious. Anybody should be able to figure that out. Anybody, whether you're an NRA guy or an anti-gun person, you can assume that if nobody's getting there for a period of time, longer the time, the more casualties. So I'm actually going to show you the model running here now. Hopefully. Okay, so we've got, again, the response time here that says, let's start it with just 2 minutes. That was a little more than the response time we had that January. No concealed carry and no security guard present. So we actually can see the police car. This is running at 10 times real time. The police car is moving there. The shooter has gone in the first room and engaged one of the employees. He's now going to the next room. We basically have the shooter randomly going from room to room. They are not necessarily a smart shooter because sometimes they'll go, since we tell them they can go from any room to any room, they'll sometimes walk across the entire facility. That's fairly accurate when you kind of look at some of these historical events. So you basically see that the police came in. I'll run that one more time. The police, when they get there, will come out of the vehicle, they'll enter the facility, and they'll basically go to the sound of gunfire, or basically that's the way we've developed the model. So you see again the police is coming, is moving to the back room, and is engaged them in that general area. So that's essentially what happens for just the police response. We go back and we change the probability concealed carry to 1 and rerun the model. Again, we can test policies here, right? Went in, the first employee was challenged. Now we've set up the model right now that says any challenge, the thing comes to an end. We probably need to make sure this is a little bit more realistic because that's probably not always going to be one-to-one. The shooter's got an advantage because they know they're coming in. So the police come in, the police respond as they would. There are risks with concealed carry. Police are coming and responding to the scene of a shooting, and they're looking for somebody in civilian clothes appropriate for that, or that looks like they fit out of place. If the police came here and said there's an active shooter in the room, they're going to look for one of us in civilian clothes with a gun. If I'm a concealed carry guy, that's a big risk, big responsibility as well. So we need to think about that when we develop the policies. We also show you what happens if we add a security guard. And I'll go back to 0 chance of concealed carry. So you see the security guard started in the back corner. Again, the model needs a little bit more work from this point of view, but basically the security guard challenge just right up front. Yes, ma'am? Yes, yeah, in this case. It could be not armed, and we've got a number of cases where hospitals and other organizations just adamantly say no armed security guards, and that we can actually attribute here as well. So essentially what we've done with the model and what we've done basically with this start screen is we've allowed police and school planners or these gun-free zone planners to think about what constructs they've put in place when they declare that gun-free zone. If you declared it a gun-free zone, that means you're waiting on the police or the shooter is basically going to do their job. If you allow for other assets like security guards or concealed carry, then you've got choices that might allow you to speed this. Now, I actually look at this and say we could change that police response time from 2 minutes up to the national average of 10 minutes. We can take it for whatever it is in our community. We can also go back, and if you want more security in your particular facility to mitigate this kind of event, the answer might not be a security guard. It might not be concealed carry. It might be working with the police department to improve response time. That might be one of the things that we think about as we mitigate this. We got some communities out west that are going to be adamant that guns are a part of their life. Guns are everywhere, and maybe that makes great sense for them. We've got other communities that say, concealed carry, that they feel that's an issue. Again, we think that the modeling that we've done and the approach we've taken allows the community or allows planners to actually, check their values, check their public, and do something that makes sense for them. When we think about Manhattan, because of the vertical density, there's nearly a police officer on every corner. That's certainly not the case on our campus or in central Indiana. And it's certainly not going to be the case out in some of our western states where it's even less populous. So this allows us to kind of check some of those possibilities and engineer the system. We can also look at the security guard versus concealed carry. And I'll show you some results of how we've actually compared those. This was actually the student project that was just recently published. And we basically had several scenarios. We had a basic scenario that says we're going to wait on the police. That, police response time, and we're just waiting on them to show up. We have a resource officer or the security guard in the schools, an armed law enforcement officer in the school. We had 5% concealed carry, 10% concealed carry, and then we did combinations. And you can see that you've got 2 bars here. One is time to engage in minutes, and the other is number of casualties. So the basic scenario, you see just short of 20 casualties. You see about that 10-minute response time. Again, there's some randomness that we put into the model up front, allows us to test that. And we look at the Resource officer's response time is about 4 minutes getting across a facility. Think of that as a high school. We started this with a similar diagram of a typical high school design, and the casualties are about just over 6 average. And this is, I think, Adam, correct me, 50 runs, I think, is how this was set up originally. So we go from just under 19 casualties to just above 6 with just the addition of a security officer. We see slight additions with concealed carry, and again, we assumed very, very conservative concealed carry standards. The teacher didn't run into the hallway like a law enforcement officer. They weren't rallying to the sound of gunfire. They sheltered in place with their children, locked the door if they had a lock, and basically said, I'll engage them, as opposed to the teachers that we've seen in some of these other active shooter events that they tell the kids, stand behind me and I'll get shot first. So we're allowing a handful of the teachers in this scenario to basically protect themselves. We get even further advances with concealed carry and resource officers. We can see those dramatic differences. So essentially, this allows us to think about this a bit differently and think about, well, do we work on response time? Do we add other resources in the school? And we can allow this model to be used community by community, checking their values. If it's a very urban area that is very adverse to having more firearms around, we can work on response time. If we're a very rural community that concealed carry is important, we can go there. One of our Indiana school districts, actually as a condition of employment for principals, has demanded that they get concealed carry permits, firearms, and training, and they are that backstop in those schools. Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. Let me go back. You mean between these? Between this?
Yeah, that one, the second one, and the...
I don't know what. We would say the most dramatic change was just by the addition of the resource officer. Less dramatic change by the concealed carry. When you say significant, it just, this is a model, so I can make the model run 10,000 times and make sure that even that small difference is significant. I would say there is a difference, there is a change, and it really comes back again, I think, to community by community is going to have different values and different standards. What if the resource officer is sick one day? What if there's something else that happens? And that's where this sort of defense in depth idea might be a wise thing if your community accepts that. If your community doesn't accept that, says no firearms in the schools, then we need to be thinking more of this, how do we work on police response time? But essentially, some of this planning needs to happen, and we need to demand that our schools, our places of employment start thinking about some of these things as they happen. Again, we look at the dramatic response time reductions, the dramatic casualty reductions. That's really what we should be doing, is thinking about how do we have a material change in the output? How do we change outcomes? We can't change that these kind of lunatics are going to come and cause harm to our schools, cause harm to our sense of safety and well-being. We need to make sure that there's some means of addressing that. So I want to leave a few minutes to kind of take any other questions you might have, but basically I've taken this on as a learning project. These things that I do are integrated into all the classes that I do. I really seek to use these courses to maximize the impact to build workforce-ready students. I think it's important for us to think about, we have one singular product out of Purdue, really. It's not our papers, it's not our grants, it's not kind of, how well somebody's going to read my bio at the beginning of one of these things because, my mom isn't here and nobody else really cares. So we ought to be thinking about, Purdue is a place that our only output are those shiny faces with those caps and gowns the end of every semester. And that really ought to be one of those things that we're pushing. How do we have them ready to enter the workforce? And from my perspective, how do I have a small number of them ready to enter the workforce as engineers or teachers or whatever the major? And we've got students from almost every major that have taken my Homeland Security classes are ready to add to that system. The applied research and the engagement that I do are really, I think, one and the same. The applied research is trying to help somebody in an engagement kind of activity. And the research projects, we hope, are bringing science and to the policy solving process. Hopefully this is a happier event than the gloom and doom that we'll have from dealing with active shooters. But we also make sure the students have better understanding of these security measures, whether they're going to work for government or business. Overall, we hope that these methods, these security methods, are adding to security and liberty solutions and making sure we don't have to make an uninformed kind of decision or choice between liberty or security. So with that, I'll be happy to take any questions. We can run the model again if you want to see the model again. But so, any questions? Yes, sir.
Have any of those projects led to any major policy shifts, either here in state, or nationwide? And if not, like, what is that next step to take something, that information, and actually influence policy shift?
Well, some of it has. The shooting we had that January, President Daniels asked me to work with some of the staff here to actually figure out what changes, what implementation of actions do we need to take after that shooting. I think most of you will see that there's a lock on every classroom now. That didn't exist before. Before we told the shelter in place, but the expectation was if we would barricade something in front of the door, our door opens out, so I'm not quite sure how we build a barrier so the shooter basically has a platform to shoot into the classroom. So that's changed for our academic spaces. That was what we determined from a risk basis was our number one worry. A lot of us with offices, the faculty in offices have locks on their doors. It's the kids and the students, I'm sorry, the kids. My kids are still in Purdue, so be nice. Students, they've got locks on their living quarters and so on. So the one place that we didn't, that we had large gatherings of students was the classroom. So that's where we thought, so that change has happened. You can imagine the NRA has been very interested in my work because they look at it and say, Dietz is for concealed carry. Well, they forget when I was at the state, Dietz also told them to get out of the state house with their guns, that we locked up the state house, we put security there, and we made the concealed carry people keep their guns at home that day. And the NRA didn't like it that day. So, this isn't a binary. We need to be thinking about where are the places and places that will accept certain actions and where the places we won't. In the case of the State House, we told those individuals there, we've got 2 cops on every door. We've got law enforcement officers in each of the houses. We got them in the governor's office. We got them in the courts. We don't need more people with guns in a crowded State House, much to the urban area. But if we're in the rural area, there's places in Indiana that we have response times over 10 minutes, well over 10 minutes. You really want to go tell those folks they're not allowed to protect themselves, going back to our founding documents and the Second Amendment and the rest of the Bill of Rights. So we need to be thinking about those. So we have had some positive impact on change. We made one change at one of the sporting events for security, that one action, one simple action. Instead of taking the ticket and tearing the bottom of it off, we flipped the ticket over and put a slash on it. That one action saved 2,000 man-hours in one Indianapolis 500 kind of staffing race. So 2,000 man-hours might ring to you as one FTE, one full-time equivalent, but delivered in one morning of one day. So we have had some good impacts, I think, that are being implemented and put out. And my successor down at the state is anxious to come up to see what my students are doing and what we can do to try to help them and continue to help them with policy decisions. Again, I look at this as my research, I hope, is making those policy impacts and getting the policy thinkers to start thinking about changing outcomes but doing it back with science. Yes, ma'am.
Do you currently work with any other organizations in an attempt to help disseminate some of this information to affect policy? For example, you talked about the benefits of the resource officer, but within Indiana schools, many resource officers are funded by grants that are running out. So are you coupling with other organizations to help?
Indiana has a school resource officer organization that fits under the national umbrella. They're aware of our research. I've actually written grants that tried to include them. I think the answer is going to be less grant money and more kind of what do we want as a decision in local funding, and then how do we take on those decisions in local funding in a way that changes the outcome. If the outcome is trying to save lives, then maybe the resource officer is a good idea. I've had a lot of, as you can imagine, as soon as the media starts talking about, oh my gosh, there's, somebody wants to put more guns in school, not less, because that's really sort of an oxymoron, right? If you want to stop gun shootings in schools, how can adding guns be better? There's a good deal of research that suggests that's not necessarily a negative thing. So some of the organizations that do training, I found one company in Florida that trains school resource officers, and they train them to kind of be more regular guys than cops. And they've actually collected some data that they represent as pretty scientific. I'm not sure it's gone through all the IRB things and things that we would demand be done on campus, but they had untrained officers go into the classroom and ask some first grade students to draw a picture of what just happened. And the untrained officer ends up with this giant gun, these shiny shoes, and kind of the things that you would expect for 6-year-old kids to portray. And after the training in different classrooms, they actually ask the kids to do the same thing, and they find more of a regular guy. He might happen to have a gun, but it's kind of put more into proportion with kind of the regular guy things that the training has embodied. So I think there are some actions out there that we can take that are prudent, that we don't make our kids frightened. I mean, there's a number of us that if we thought somebody in the room was armed, we would be frightened. Like, oh my God, why do they need a gun here? It's like, well, you don't hear a lot of convenience stores and restaurants getting held up in Texas because the 6 moms in the McDonald's, 4 of them probably have guns that are going to shoot the guy, in the back when he goes to the cash register to take the money. So we certainly have places that are, criminals know I don't go there because I know they're pretty sure there's guns. And so we need to be thinking about what does make good policy and go back to first principles to try to figure out how do we defend good policy and manage to better inform the public that this is why we need it. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
My question basically is more of a comment than anything is, how in the devil did we get in this situation anyway? Because I can remember when I went to school in southern Indiana and my father bought me my first gun. I got on the bus with the gun. I took it to school and showed everybody, and nobody thought a thing about it.
I'm reminded of something I saw in the news recently that some kid chewed his Pop-Tart into the shape of a gun and was expelled. So, says, from the gentleman with the NRA shirt on, I agree. I think we need to think about what we're doing. I'm not sure I necessarily would say as a matter of policy, if I were a high school principal, I'd want every child at the school to be able to carry the guns to school. But we do have hunting cultures. We have other cultures that actually gun sport, shooting sports that happen, and those are after school activities. Yes, sir.
Well, the thing on the gun at school too, my grandson, who was a scout, still is, forgot and left his pocket knife in his pocket when he went to school the next day. And he went directly to the principal's office to tell him, I made a mistake, I forgot to take my knife out of my pocket. He was expelled from school, so in other words, he's being expelled for doing something right. So does that teach him, well, you just need to lie the next time?
That's, I think that goes back into our value process, and we need to be reassessing that.
I told my daughter, I said, it's a good thing that Grandpa wasn't there.
Yes, sir. Any other questions? Yeah.
I would just be curious to hear what you think about the recent events with the kid that walked into school with a clock that they thought was a bomb. I was just curious how you felt about that. Like if someone. Okay, so I would just like to hear what you thought. So in other words.
It's a funny thing as facts come out after originally the story was here was some genius kid who found some parts and built a clock out of parts. As it turns out, there were some people that did some research and found out that was a clock radio that used to have a nice little case and sit on the side of somebody's bed that was made in between 1980 and 88, I think. And basically the kid took a screwdriver or a hammer and took the case out of it and threw the parts in the box. And so that was what afterwards was portrayed as this invention of the clock, because the clock was really sort of a defabrication of a finished product and put in a case. And unfortunately, we have a culture that these bad events happen. And we have training that we do with all the public called See Something, Say Something. So you see some kid with a box with a bunch of wires in a case, and that's an odd place for a clock. It's an odd place for some of the components too, because it wasn't Radio Shack components. It was finished production boards and components that were in a case. And they asked the child, what is it? And he said, it's a clock. And he said, well, and that's all he'd say, except I want to talk to my parents. So it seems to me we haven't heard all of that story yet, and there might be some agitation that's going on there. But I think in this See Something, Say Something climate, what would have happened if that wouldn't have been a clock that was demanufactured and put in a battered briefcase? but actually some kids like Columbine that were doing something much more mischievous. The principals, the teachers would have been crucified for not challenging that appropriately. So I think we need to be careful about kind of attributing too much credit to the kid for being a genius, because originally that was the allegation. As it turns out, it may not be so true, and the teacher was originally portrayed as drastic overreaction. I think we need to be a little more cautious with that. Probably a little bit more patience with all these things are always a good thing. Any other questions? Yes.
Do you think the whole social media monitoring for security purposes is kind of in its infancy, and what can we expect to see in the future from that?
I suspect there's a big data problem like we wouldn't believe that is potential. We also look at this as, I had a meeting this morning that we're looking at SCADA systems, the control systems around our power grid and our water supply, our sewage supplies. I've been contacted by the National Guard to help them build a SCADA system that could actually be hacked into and attacked, so then they could practice responding to it. So you think about that. The day that we're attacked is not the first day it happens. We've been probed again. There's people talking about it. I suspect a lot of that is being done with the benefit of social media tools right now. And so we need to think about that. As we start talking about this liberty, power, tension, how much do we want government? How much do we want to pay government to look at my texts and posts, which are 0? Or my kids, which are like every 5 seconds, I think. It's like we can't have dinner plans without 47 texts and tweets or whatever back and forth to try to figure out, are we eating Chipotle or McDonald's or getting pizza? So it amazes me how much stuff is there, but how much are we willing to surrender our privacy for that? And so unfortunately, this presentation and Gene Spafford's are about the same time, so you can't kind of have the flip side to kind of think about the privacy end, which I know Gene would be talking about. So,
Thank you, Dr. Dietz. Let's go ahead and give Dr. Dietz a round of applause.